Hello students, welcome to the channel. In this video, we'll solve the first writing passage of the March 2020 US SAT, the pioneers of the Great Exodus. At the end of the Reconstruction era that followed the American Civil War, tens of thousands of Black former slaves left the southern United States for finding social and economic opportunity in the western states and territories. Now, when I read this, I feel that the best replacement for the underlined portion should be to find, right? So to find social and economic opportunity in the western states and territories. So the way it's written doesn't read right, so it's wrong. In search of, that is correct, because if I'm saying that they left the southern US in search of social and economic opportunity, then that makes sense. With a look for is not correct. I could say to look for. So this is wrong. And to the discovery of is also wrong. So the right answer is option B. The movement was known as the Great Exodus, and their participants came to be called exodusters. Now here I have to decide the correct pronoun. And this is pronoun for Great Exodus, right? The movement, that is Great Exodus. So this is singular. So I cannot use the plural pronoun there. So I would have to say its participants, the participants of the movement, came to be called exodusters. So A is wrong. His or her is incorrect because I'm talking about the movement, not a person. And once cannot be used again. Once is used with one, and one refers to oneself. So again, this can't be used for the movement. During this time, travel from one part of the country to another took days or even weeks, and the dangers wild animals posed were not to be underestimated. Which choice provides the most appropriate context for the discussion that follows in the passage? Okay, so let's just read the next part and then we'll come back to question 3. The most popular destination was Kansas, in part because of its role as an early stronghold of the movement to abolish slavery. One settlement in that state was Nicodemus, a town in northwestern Kansas that drew more than 300 settlers to make the long journey from Kentucky in 1877. Real estate agents mentioned Nicodemus in brochures and newspapers, but the reality that exodusters confronted on arrival was less appealing. For one early settler of Nicodemus, Villiana Hickman, the flat, empty landscape contrasted starkly with the forested hills where she grew up. Hickman recalled bursting into tears when she first saw her new home. Now, at this point where 4 is written, the writer is considering adding the following sentence. Between 1870 and 1879, approximately 10,000 exodusters entered Kansas. So the previous part says the most popular destination was Kansas, in part because of its role as an early stronghold. One settlement in that state was Nicodemus. So I'm already speaking about a settlement in Kansas, right? So at this point, it wouldn't do for me to talk about how many exodusters entered Kansas, right? This could have gone at this position, right? Because that's where I've spoken about Kansas, the state. But here I have already spoken about Nicodemus, and then I'm continuing to speak about that town. So this would be a no answer. No, because it contradicts information in the previous paragraph. No, because it digresses from the discussion of the settlement of Nicodemus. So it's D, right? To digress is to go away from. So I am going to focus on Nicodemus here. So this information doesn't make sense. It's not C because it doesn't contradict with information, right? Yes, it is true that there were many exodusters who came to Kansas. So there's nothing contradictory here. Okay, which choice most effectively sets up the information that follows in the paragraph? So I need to talk about real estate agents and how they advertised Nicodemus. And then it says the reality that exodusters confronted was less appealing. So, which is to say that real estate agents must have hyped up the place in a certain manner, but the reality was less appealing. And particularly if you look at Williana Hickman's experience, it says categorically that she was looking for the kind of rural beauty, the rural setting that she had grown up around with forested hills, etc. And that was not present here. So, no change, which is to say, they mentioned Nicodemus in brochures and newspapers, wrote songs and slogans to attract settlers, advertised the location and characteristics of Nicodemus, promised plentiful harvests and abundant wildlife. So it would be D, right? Because if I say that real estate agents promised plentiful harvests and abundant wildlife, but the reality was less appealing, the landscape was flat and empty, right? So that contrasts with what the rest of the paragraph says. The fact that they mentioned it in brochures, that doesn't really set up any contrast. That's in fact what a real estate agent would do to advertise a location. So it's not A. Writing songs and slogans to attract settlers is not contrasting with the flat landscape mentioned. So it's not B. Advertise the location and characteristic of Nicodemus is fine, but it doesn't tell me what characteristics they advertised, right? So the characteristics they advertised were plentiful harvests and abundant wildlife. So that is the contrast that I need to establish. Okay, let's look at third now. So this obviously doesn't make sense because I have just introduced exodusters, so I should speak about them. The dangers that wild animals pose during journey is not relevant at this point. Settlers from Kentucky, Tennessee, and Missouri were part of the Great Exodus. Okay, so I'll keep this for now. The Great Exodus has parallels to large-scale migrations that occurred in the US during the 20th century. No, that's not relevant. I don't need to compare it to other great migrations because right now my focus is on the Great Exodus and the people who migrated, the exodusters. Drawn by the promise of farming on their own land rather than sharecropping for a landlord, exodusters founded dozens of communities in the West in the 1870s and 1880s. Yeah, so I think D is a better answer than B because first I'm kind of defining the term exodusters. I'm saying that, they were drawn by the promise of farming on their own land rather than working for a landlord. And then I'm saying that they founded dozens of communities, the most popular of which was Kansas. So it also kind of flows into the next paragraph. So this is more appropriate than B because in B, I'm just talking about settlers from different states. I'm not talking about exodusters, the term exodusters at all. So D is better. Some exodusters returned to the familiar expanse of their home states, but others, including Hickman and her husband Daniel, decided to stay in their new farming villages. So some exodusters returned to the familiar terrain, right? That would be a good answer because terrain basically means how the landscape is, right? So they wanted to go back to a landscape that was plentiful, a landscape that was lush. So that would make the most sense. Expanse is used in the context of how large a particular area is, right? So the expanse of the fields before him. So it has that connotation. So it wouldn't really make sense in the context of a particular landscape. Spread, again, is not really relevant to landscape. Spread can be used in a variety of connotations, but I need to say that the exodusters wanted to return to familiar landscape, right? So that's not correct. And locale doesn't indicate landscape. Locale is basically used to indicate a particular location. So this also is not the best answer in context. Now, some exodusters returned to the familiar terrain of their home states, but others, including Hickman and her husband, decided to stay in their new farming villages. So the first thing I notice is that I have a conjunction here. So it would make sense to have a comma before the conjunction, because when I have one of the fanboys, F for, A for and, N for not, B for but, O for or, Y for yet, and S for so. So when I have one of the fanboys conjunctions and I'm using it to join two sentences, then there is a comma before the conjunction, right? And I also need a comma after others, because this part, others decided to stay in their new farming villages. The part including Hickman and her husband Daniel is additional information. And since I'm closing it with a comma, I need to open it with a comma as well, not a dash. So D is the best answer. A is wrong. Okay, if I put a dash here and I take out the comma here, then this part does not remain additional anymore. So this is wrong. And here I'm joining two independent clauses, but then I'm putting a conjunction after the semicolon. So this is also wrong. These farmers faced many difficulties. In Nicodemus, the lack of trees for home construction or fuel forced settlers to build houses out of sod and burn materials such as sunflowers for heat. Possessing less wealth than settlers from Europe or other parts of the United States, horses or farm implements could not be afforded by many exodusters who had to do agricultural work with inadequate hand tools. Now, this part, possessing less wealth than settlers from Europe, this is a modifier. So the part after the comma should begin with the subject that the modifier refers to. Who possessed less wealth than settlers from Europe? The exodusters, right? So many exodusters would be the subject, and it would start the part after the comma. I can't start with horses or farm implements. I can't start with affording horses or farm implements, and I can't start with the lack of affordability. Possessing less wealth than settlers from Europe, many exodusters could not afford horses or farm implements and had to do agricultural work with inadequate hand tools. In the first years, many could not raise enough crops to sustain themselves and had to seek aid from neighbors or state governments. The prosperity of exoduster settlements depended on the yields of their farms. Eventually, harvests in Nicodemus grew, which allowed residents to purchase lumber for their houses and attracted banks, grocery stores, and other businesses. So here I'm saying the prosperity of these settlements depended on the yields of their farms and the fact that they had trouble initially. Eventually, though, harvests in Nicodemus grew. So eventually is like ultimately, so that makes sense as a connector. Still wouldn't make sense because still would mean a contrast. And that is not what I'm saying here. I'm basically saying that with the passage of time, harvests in Nicodemus grew. So this is wrong. Rather would also indicate another side of an argument or a contrast. So this doesn't make sense. And next would make sense when you're talking about steps in a process, right? But that's not what I'm doing here. I'm talking about a duration of time, something that happened after a period of time. So eventually is the best answer, option A, which allowed residents to purchase lumber for their houses and attracted banks, grocery stores, and other businesses. So here I have a list and I'm going to use commas to separate items on the list. So banks, comma, grocery stores, comma, and other businesses. This makes sense. So option A is good. Okay, I can't have a comma between grocery and stores because grocery stores is one item. So this is wrong. I can't use a semicolon to separate items on a list unless the items themselves have commas between them. So this is not right. And this again is wrong because I need to create a list. So the answer is A. But the challenges of small scale farming, exacerbated and made worse by economic volatility, slowed the great exodus. By the 20th century, Nicodemus had stopped growing, with many businesses moving away, and other exoduster communities had disappeared altogether. Now here I need to decide the best replacement for this. And I noticed that this is a redundancy question because to exacerbate is to make worse, right? So when I say exacerbated by economic volatility, that means made worse, right? So this is a redundancy. Exacerbated and worsened, again, redundant. Exacerbated alone is fine because I'm saying that the challenges were made worse. They were exacerbated by economic volatility. And made worse by exacerbation is again redundant. So the best answer is option C. Okay, let's grade this. B, C, D, 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 B, C, D, 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 B, D, C, A, A, C, B, D, C. Yeah, this is what I meant to mark. B, D, C, A, A, C. Okay, so we got all correct. Hope this helped. If it did, hit like and subscribe to the channel. Over the last couple of videos, I've been uploading solutions to the March 2020 SAT. So be sure to check the other videos out. I'll see you guys soon. Take care. Bye-bye.